I need to tell you something that happened to me, and I promise you, no matter how unbelievable it sounds, every word of it is true. I still have the phone records. I still have the receipts. And somewhere 3 hours away from the house I raised my son in, there's a teenage girl who changed my entire life with one wrong number. For 6 years, my husband told me he traveled for work 3 times a month. Same territory, same route, same excuse every single time. I believed him completely. And then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a girl's voice came through my phone, asking why her daddy hadn't visited in 3 weeks. She used his name, his full name, and that's the moment I understood I wasn't the only wife in this marriage. My name is Rachel. I'm an elementary school teacher, which means I spend my days noticing the small things kids don't say out loud, the ones who flinch when a door slams, the ones who go quiet right before they lie about their homework. I've always been good at reading people. I just never thought I'd need that skill on my own husband. I met Mark when I was 29. He was steady in a way I found comforting after years of dating men who weren't. He remembered my coffee order. He called when he said he'd call, and within a year, he proposed with a ring he'd clearly put real thought into. We got married, had our son Emily 2 years later. Yes, Emily, my mother's name, something Mark insisted on even though it's usually a girl's name, and something I loved him for at the time. We built a life that looked, from every outside angle, completely ordinary, completely safe. Mark worked in equipment sales, which meant travel was part of the job description from the very beginning. 3 trips a month, sometimes 4, always to the same general territory a few hours away. He'd leave Thursday morning, come back Sunday night, tired but affectionate, always with a small gift for Emily and something practical for me. A scarf, a candle, the kind of gift a busy man grabs at an airport gift shop between meetings. I never questioned it. Why would I? It was just the rhythm of our marriage. The tide going out and coming back in month after month, year after year. The first thing that ever struck me as odd, and I want to be honest, it struck me as odd for maybe 30 seconds before I let it go, was his hotel receipts. He'd hand them to me for our records, flat reimbursement rates, no itemized meals, no incidentals, nothing personal. Just a clean, round number every single time. I remember asking him about it once, almost as a joke. Your company just gives you a flat per diem? And he said, yeah, easier for accounting. Saves everyone the headache of itemizing. It made sense. It sounded like something a large company would actually do. I filed the receipt and moved on with my day. That was the first small brick in a wall I didn't know I was building around the truth. 6 years passed like that. Not unhappily. I want to be clear about that because I think people assume a marriage like mine must have been miserable for something like this to happen. It wasn't. We laughed at dinner. We took Emily to soccer practice together on the weekends Mark was home. We fought about normal things whose turn it was to deal with the in-laws, whether we could afford a kitchen renovation. It was, by every visible measure, a good marriage. That's what makes this so hard to explain to people who ask me how I didn't know sooner. You don't look for cracks in a foundation you've never had reason to distrust. There were small moments, scattered across those years, that I've since gone back and re-examined with a completely different eye. Mark would occasionally miss a call from me during his trips, sometimes for hours at a stretch, always with an explanation ready. Bad service, back-to-back meetings, a phone that died at the worst possible time. There was a stretch, maybe 4 years in, when he started keeping his phone face down on the nightstand instead of charging it openly on the kitchen counter the way he used to. I remember noticing that shift and thinking, briefly, that maybe he was just being more private as he got older. People change their habits. I told myself that 100 different ways, 100 different times, because the alternative wasn't something I had any reason to consider. Once, at a company holiday party, one of Mark's coworkers made an offhand joke about him being the most requested guy in the territory, and everyone laughed, including me, assuming it was about his sales numbers. I think about that comment constantly now. I wonder how many people around him knew, in fragments, without ever putting the whole picture together the way Jenna and I eventually would. The call came on a Tuesday in March, a little after 4 in the afternoon. I was grading spelling tests at my kitchen table, half paying attention to the television, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I don't know why I didn't. A girl's voice came through, young, maybe 14 or 15, a little breathless like she'd been building up the courage to make the call. Daddy? It's Sophie. Why haven't you visited in 3 weeks? Are you still coming this weekend? I sat there for a second, completely confused, assuming she'd misdialed. I think you have the wrong number, sweetheart, I said gently. Is this Mark Coleman's phone? She asked. And there it was, my husband's full name, spoken by a girl I had never heard of in my entire life. I don't remember exactly what I said after that. I think I asked her a few gentle questions, how old she was, where she lived, whether Daddy was Mark Coleman who worked in equipment sales, and every answer she gave landed like a physical blow. She said he visited almost every month. She said he'd missed her birthday because of work stuff, but always made it up to her. She said her mom's name was Jenna. When I hung up the phone, I sat perfectly still at my kitchen table for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. Emily's spelling tests were still spread out in front of me, half graded, red pen still in my hand. I remember thinking very clearly that I needed to decide right then whether I was going to fall apart or figure this out. I chose to figure it out. I understand why, because I know it sounds strange that I sat on this kind of information. But I'd spent enough years around manipulative situations, watching kids at school explain away things that clearly weren't okay, to know that if I went to Mark with nothing but a phone call from a stranger, he would talk his way around it in about 90 seconds. He was good like that. Calm under pressure. Always had an explanation ready. I needed something he couldn't explain away. So instead of confronting him, I started digging. I pulled up 6 years of credit card statements that night after Emily went to bed, cross-referencing them against Mark's travel calendar, which he'd always kept meticulously in a shared family app, so I know when Daddy's home, as he used to say. The pattern jumped out at me almost immediately, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every single month, like clockwork, there was a gap of 3 to 4 days that aligned perfectly with his travel dates. Every single month for 6 years. That's not a business trip schedule. That's a second life with a maintenance schedule. I traced the girl's phone number the following weekend, using nothing more than an online reverse lookup and a lot of patience. It led me to an address 3 hours away, in a small town Mark had always described only as sales territory. Nothing personal, nothing memorable. I stared at that address on my screen for a long time before I made the decision that changed everything. I told my sister I needed her to watch Emily for the day, gave her some vague explanation about a doctor's appointment, and I got in my car on a Saturday morning and drove 3 hours without telling a single soul where I was actually going. The drive gave me too much time to think, which might have been a mistake. 3 hours alone in a car is a long time to sit with a suspicion that big, and somewhere around the second hour, I found myself constructing an entirely different, gentler explanation just to give myself something to hold onto. Maybe it was a coworker's daughter, confused, dialing an old shared work phone. Maybe there was some version of this where Mark's name was common enough that a stranger's daughter simply shared it by coincidence. I knew, even as I built that story in my head, that I didn't believe a word of it. But it got me through the drive without pulling over on the shoulder of the highway, which felt like its own small victory at the time. By the time I pulled into that town, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Not from fear exactly, but from the sheer uncertainty of what I might find. Maybe nothing. Maybe an innocent explanation I hadn't considered. Some small, desperate part of me was still hoping for that, right up until the moment I turned onto that quiet residential street and saw the address matching exactly what I traced days earlier. The house was modest, well kept, with a small front yard and a child's bicycle leaning against the porch railing. And on the mailbox, in plain block letters, was a name that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of my car. Coleman. Not just Mark's territory. Mark's name. On a mailbox. Attached to a house I had never known existed. For a family I had never known existed. Built under our own last name like it was just another branch of the same tree. I sat in the car for almost 15 minutes before I got out. When I finally knocked on that door, a woman about my age answered, wiping her hands on a dish towel, confusion written all over her face at the sight of a stranger on her porch. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Is this Mark Coleman's house?" I asked, and I watched her face change in real time, the same way I imagined mine had changed on that phone call days earlier. "Who's asking?" she said, her voice suddenly careful. "I'm his wife," I said. "Rachel." She went pale, genuinely, visibly pale, the dish towel slipping from her hands onto the porch floor. "I'm his wife too," she said. "Jenna." We stood there on that porch for a long moment, two women who had never met, staring at each other like we were trying to solve a math problem that refused to make sense no matter how many times we ran the numbers. Then, without either of us saying much else, she stepped back and let me inside. We sat at her kitchen table for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, comparing our lives piece by piece like we were assembling a puzzle neither of us had known we were part of. She'd met Mark almost the exact same year I had, just a few months apart. He'd told her he traveled constantly for regional accounts, the same words he'd used with me. He gave her nearly identical anniversary gifts to the ones he gave me on nearly the same dates, sometimes within days of each other. It wasn't sloppiness. It was discipline. He had built 2 entire calendars and run them in parallel for 6 years without either of us ever crossing paths. At one point, Jenna went quiet and asked me something that broke my heart in a completely different way than anything else that day. "Is Emily real?" she asked. "He's mentioned an Emily before. I always assumed it was a co-worker." "Emily's our son," I said. "He's 9. Jenna put her face in her hands at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. 13 years, she said. 13 years I've been telling people this is my husband. I introduced him to my parents. My father walked me down an aisle at a backyard ceremony we never legally registered because Mark told me it wasn't necessary, that we were already married in every way that mattered." She laughed, short and bitter. I actually believed that. I believed common law marriage was just something that happened automatically if you stayed together long enough. Why would I have questioned that? He was my husband. Why would my husband lie to me about something as basic as whether we were actually married? I didn't have an answer for her. I don't think there was one that would have made either of us feel better in that moment. We just sat there, 2 women who had built entire lives around the same man's word, slowly realizing how carefully those 2 lives had been kept apart. She showed me photos on her phone at one point, birthdays, a trip to the coast, Sophie's first day of high school. I recognized the jacket Mark was wearing in one of them. It was the same jacket he'd worn in a photo from Emily's school play 2 years earlier, the one still sitting in a frame on our living room mantel. Seeing that jacket in someone else's photo album, in someone else's living room, in someone else's version of our life, was somehow one of the most disorienting moments of that entire afternoon. It was somewhere in that conversation that we discovered the legal wrinkle that made everything worse. I was legally married to Mark, marriage certificate on file, 6 years of joint tax returns, the whole structure of a legitimate marriage. Jenna had believed for over a decade that she and Mark were common law married, which in her state, as it turned out, required specific legal conditions she didn't actually meet. She had no marriage certificate, no legal protection, nothing but a man's word and 13 years of a life built entirely on trust. He told me common law marriage just happens automatically after a certain number of years together, she said quietly. I never checked. Why would I check on my own marriage? I understood that question more than she probably realized. Sophie, the girl whose wrong number call had started all of this, came home from a friend's house partway through our conversation and immediately sensed something was wrong. She stood in the kitchen doorway, backpack still on one shoulder, looking between her mother and a strange woman sitting at their kitchen table with red, exhausted eyes. What's going on? She asked. Mom? Who is this? Jenna tried to soften it, tried to find some gentle version of the truth to give her 15-year-old daughter. But Sophie was sharp, sharper than either of us gave her credit for in that moment, and she pieced it together faster than I expected. He has another family, she said, not as a question. That's why he's never around on weekends. That's why he missed my birthday. Her voice cracked on the last part, and something in me broke all over again watching a child absorb the same betrayal I was still trying to process myself. Jenna and I made a decision that day that I think, looking back, was the smartest thing either of us did in this entire ordeal. We agreed not to confront Mark right away. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. If we went to him separately with half-formed suspicions, he would manage us the way he'd clearly managed both of us for 6 years, calm, controlled, an explanation for everything. We needed the full picture first. Every date, every dollar, every lie laid out so completely that there would be nothing left for him to talk his way around. I drove home that night in silence, no radio, just my own thoughts circling the same drain over and over. I picked Emily up from my sister's house, hugged him a little too long, and told him I loved him 3 times before bed instead of the usual once. He asked if something was wrong. I told him I was just tired. It was the first real lie I ever told my son, and I hated every second of it, even knowing why I had to. Over the next 2 weeks, Jenna and I built our case the way 2 women who'd both been quietly wronged for years learned to build things, carefully, patiently, without giving away that anything had changed. I went to visit Mark's sister, Diane, under the guise of asking about an old family recipe, and within 20 minutes of casual conversation, I could tell she was holding something back. When I finally asked her directly if she'd ever noticed anything strange about Mark's travel, she went very quiet and admitted that about a year earlier, she'd found an odd receipt in his car for a birthday cake in a town he claimed to have no personal connection to. She said she'd assumed it was a work thing. She said she didn't want to start something without being sure. I understood her hesitation. I even forgave it eventually. But in that moment, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table, all I could think about was how many people, in small, quiet ways, had chosen not to be the one who said something, and how that silence had let this go on for exactly as long as it did. Jenna, meanwhile, discovered something that turned this from a story about infidelity into a story about theft. She found records of a joint business expense account that Mark had access to through his company, an account I had always assumed covered legitimate work costs, hotel stays, gas, client dinners. Money from that account had been quietly routed, month after month, to cover a portion of Jenna's mortgage payments. Money that, in a roundabout way, had come from the same household budget I managed at home, the same account I'd trusted him to handle responsibly for 6 years. When we added it all up, the number was staggering. Not enough to bankrupt us, but enough to make it clear this wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was a financial one, calculated and sustained, month after month, year after year. 10 days after that first porch conversation, Mark packed his usual bag for his usual monthly trip, kissed Emily goodbye at the door, told him to be good for mommy, and kissed me on the cheek on his way out like it was any other Thursday morning. I stood in that doorway and watched him walk to his car with a version of composure I didn't know I had in me. He had no idea. None. He climbed into his car, backed out of our driveway, and drove 3 hours directly into the middle of a confrontation he never saw coming. Jenna and I had arranged everything in advance. Sophie knew. Mark believed he was arriving for a normal weekend visit, the same routine he'd followed for 6 years without a single misstep. Instead, when he walked through that front door, bag in hand, keys still in his pocket, he found both of his wives sitting at the same kitchen table, a folder of documents spread out between us like a hand of cards finally being shown. I have never, in my life, seen a person's face change the way Mark's did in that doorway. The color drained out of it almost instantly. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without any sound coming out. For a man who had built an entire second life on the strength of always having an explanation ready, he suddenly had nothing. Rachel, he finally said, my name coming out like a question, like he was still trying to figure out how 2 completely separate compartments of his life had somehow collided in the same room. This isn't, I can explain. Explain what, Mark? I asked, and I remember how calm my own voice sounded, calmer than I actually felt. Explain Jenna? Explain Sophie? Explain the mortgage payments? Pick one. He tried anyway. He always tried. He said he loved us both, in different ways, that he never meant for it to go this far, that he'd always intended to figure it out eventually, as if 6 years was some kind of transitional period rather than the entire architecture of his adult life. He said he never wanted to hurt either of us, as if the not wanting was supposed to matter more than the doing. You had 6 years to figure it out, Jenna said, her voice shaking with a kind of controlled fury I hadn't heard from her before that moment. You had a mortgage payment schedule figured out. You had our anniversaries figured out down to the week. Don't you dare sit there and tell us you just hadn't figured it out yet. Mark looked between the two of us, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him actually run out of words. Not a pause before a calculated response. Just nothing. His mouth moved, and no sound came out, like a man who had spent 6 years rehearsing for every possible confrontation, except the one where both audiences were sitting in the same room at the same time. I need you to understand, he finally said, quieter now, that neither of you was ever fake to me. Both of you were real. That's not a comfort, Mark, I said. That's the whole problem. Sophie, sitting quietly at the edge of the kitchen through most of this, finally spoke up, and her question landed harder than anything either Jenna or I had said. Is Emily even real? She asked her father directly. Do I actually have a brother, or was that just another lie? Mark hesitated, just for a second, but that hesitation in front of both of his families at once said everything that needed to be said. Emily was real. His son was real. And Mark had spent years deciding, quietly in his own head, how much of the truth each of his children deserved to know about the other. I filed for divorce 2 weeks later, citing both infidelity and financial fraud, since the diverted business account funds gave my attorney a much stronger footing than emotional betrayal alone would have provided. My attorney, a calm, methodical woman named Grace who'd clearly seen every version of marital collapse imaginable, told me the financial paper trail alone would likely secure a fair settlement without a drawn-out fight, since Mark had no real defense for money that had been documented, dated, and routed in his own handwriting on old expense forms. Jenna, once she understood she'd never actually been legally married, consulted her own attorney about what little recourse she had, and about protecting whatever she could for Sophie's sake going forward. It turned out there were some limited protections available to her under a doctrine called putative spouse status, since she had genuinely and reasonably believed, for over a decade, that she was legally married. It wasn't the same as an actual marriage, but it was something, enough to argue for a portion of what Mark had contributed toward the house over the years, enough that Sophie wouldn't be left with absolutely nothing to show for 13 years of her mother's life. Mark's employer, as it turned out, had already begun quietly auditing his expense reports months before any of this came to light, flagging inconsistencies in his reimbursement claims that had nothing to do with either of us and everything to do with basic corporate accounting. Within a month of the confrontation, he was terminated for falsified expenses, the very same flat-rate hotel receipts I'd once dismissed as a company policy quirk turning out to be the thread that unraveled his professional life alongside his personal one. He lost his job. He lost both families in the same season. And for the first time in 6 years, Mark Coleman had absolutely no version of events he could manage his way around. Here's the part of this story I still find myself thinking about more than anything else. The part one never could have predicted sitting in my car outside Jenna's house that first Saturday. Jenna and I didn't become enemies. If anything, the opposite happened. Somewhere between comparing our matching anniversary gifts and building a case against the same man, something like real friendship started to form between us. We'd both been deceived by the exact same person, in almost the exact same ways, for almost the exact same number of years. There was no one else on earth who understood what that felt like quite the way we understood it in each other. I remember the first time she called me just to talk, not about Mark, not about paperwork, not about the kids' schedules, but just to ask how my week had gone. It felt strange at first, this woman who had once been a complete stranger, who I'd met on her own front porch under the worst circumstances imaginable, slowly becoming one of the only people who truly understood what I'd been through. My own friends were sympathetic, of course, but there's a specific kind of understanding that only comes from someone who lived the exact same 6 years from a different angle. Jenna knew things about Mark's patterns, his small tells, his particular way of explaining things that no one else in my life could have recognized. We started talking regularly, at first just to coordinate logistics for the kids, and eventually just because we wanted to. Emily and Sophie met for the first time about 4 months after everything came out, cautious and a little awkward the way any two kids would be discovering a sibling they never knew existed. Sophie, older and sharper, took the lead in a way that surprised me, asking Emily easy questions about school and video games, clearly trying to make the strangeness of the situation feel smaller than it actually was. Emily, for his part, mostly just seemed thrilled to have an older sister, uncomplicated by any of the adult context surrounding how that had come to be. Kids, I've learned, are often more capable of adapting to strange new truths than adults give them credit for. Diane reached out to me about 6 months after everything settled, apologizing again for her silence, and I told her honestly that I understood why she'd stayed quiet, even if I wished she hadn't. She's become, in her own careful way, part of the wider circle now, too. Sunday dinners occasionally include her, Jenna, both kids, all of us navigating a version of family that Mark never intended to create, but that grew anyway, almost in spite of him, out of the wreckage he left behind. I think about that wrong number phone call sometimes, the sheer randomness of it, a 15-year-old girl misdialing a digit, or maybe not misdialing at all. Maybe some old save contact glitching at exactly the right moment to change everything. I don't know which it was, and honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it happened, and that instead of falling apart when it did, I chose to find out exactly what I was dealing with before I let anyone else define the story for me. Mark spent 6 years making absolutely certain his two families would never meet. He managed calendars, receipts, gifts, entire versions of himself, all so that two separate lives could run in parallel without ever touching. What he never planned for, what he probably never even considered, was what would happen the day they finally did meet, that instead of destroying each other the way he likely assumed two betrayed women would, we would look at each other across that kitchen table and recognize immediately that we had far more reason to stand together than we ever had to stand against one another. He spent 6 years making sure his two families never met. He just never imagined that the day they finally did, they'd choose each other over him.